The Library by J. Dawn King, narrated by Stevie Zimmerman. Chapter 1. Court. He had been sitting across from her for almost 20 minutes in silence, listening to the pendulum's movement in the aged walnut mantel clock while watching her. He could feel the heat radiating from the stone fireplace, taking the edge off the chill of the late September day. It was his favourite room, his own personal refuge in Netherfield Park. They were each reading the same tome by Shakespeare, Hamlet. She was bewitching as she sat at the corner of the settee, periodically using the fingers on her right hand to twist a curly lock of hair around her index finger, round and around. The curl, the colour of dark mahogany, had escaped the careful confines of her hairpins. He longed to run his hands through the rich thickness of her hair, and he wondered how long it would be if it were all let loose. Would it reach to her waist, or to what lingered below? He desired to help her put the curls back, or to remove the rest of the pins. Her small slippered foot occasionally tapped a few beats on the library floor in an intermittent rhythm. He had long since lost interest in the story, and rested his book on his lap, not taking his eyes off her. As she read, her face reflected the emotions she was feeling, vacillating between anger, anticipation, and keen delight. It was Hamlet, after all. She chuckled. The tone of her voice was pleasing, playful. He was irresistibly drawn to the sound. He had read the book several times, and never had he felt the need to chuckle. What had she discovered that I had not? As enticing as he found her physical form, it was her intelligence, her wit, that had permeated his heart like the London fog creeping through the neighbourhoods, until they were covered in a blanket of grey. She had bested him several times, as they challenged each other in conversation. He wondered where she had learned the finer points of debate. His skills were developed with his father, and honed as president of the debate team at Cambridge. Though she seemed unaware that this elevated her above the others gathered in the household, he knew. His heart bore witness, pounding so loudly that he feared she would be startled by the noise. Over the past spring and summer, he had examined the offerings of the season, and had found London society's debutantes wanting. Their quickness to adjust their opinions, to suit what they thought he desired, was disgusting to him. Their inability to comment on something other than the weather, the gathering, the fashions, or the roads, frustrated him beyond measure. Each social occasion was cloaked in the sameness as the last. He had left London to assist his closest friend, Charles Bingley, in the leasing of an estate, to escape that boring sameness. It was there that he had met her, in Hertfordshire. He had not been kind to her that first night. His frustration with society, his disappointment that he had failed to prevent harm to his only sibling, Georgiana, and his irritation with the sister of his host, made him short-tempered and not the best of company at the local assembly. He had lashed out, saying unkind words that he quickly wished unspoken. Had she heard? He sincerely hoped that she had not. She had never spoken of such, and had not treated him with unkindness, so he assumed she was unaware that he had proclaimed her tolerable but not handsome enough to tempt him. He was tempted. In fact, he had never before felt the intense pull of attraction that he felt for her. He could not sleep at night for thinking of her. His days were filled with wondering how she would react to the events of his life. The words he had spoken to Bingley during the assembly at Meryton had been a lie. Disguise of every sort was abhorrent to him. He felt the weight of shame for how he had spoken of someone so lovely. He again focused all of his attention on her. Sunlight from the tall library window allowed sunbeams to move slowly across the floor, waking dust particles and inviting them to join in the dance. It placed the side of her face in shadow, the side where she twirled the curl. The small hand holding the heavy book was strong, like the legs that carried her on her long walks about the countryside. His estate, Pemberley, would open a world of new trails and paths to her that she would delight to discover. His imagination easily placed her there, enjoying the end of summer and the early days of autumn. They would have the time to watch the colours of the leaves turn from verdant to rust, from season to season, if she were there. She was a small woman, petite in form, yet strength resonated from her. Strength of character, strength of will, and strength of form. Her waist was so small that his large hands could easily circle it, should he ever have the opportunity. Her breasts were... He closed his eyes, trying to block the vision. "I am a gentleman." He inhaled deeply and resolved to clear his vision and calm his treacherous body. He knew that he had no right to examine her so closely. There was no arrangement, no courtship, and no engagement to allow him that type of freedom. With his elevated position in society, there was little likelihood that there ever would be. Even though she was a gentleman's daughter, and he was a gentleman, where they should have been equals, their circles would never merge. He mourned that thought. Opening his eyes, he focused on her lovely face. Her countenance was peaceful and serene, yet her face was alive with emotion. Her lips were full and red, where she had tucked her bottom lip under her straight white teeth, biting softly. He almost groaned aloud. Her nose was small and slightly turned up at the end, and her eyes were looking right at him. Chapter 2. Chagrin. He could feel the heat of embarrassment burning up his neck, as he squirmed in the leather chair, in the same manner he had done as a child, under the eye of his disapproving mathematics tutor. To this day I still resent that man. Fitzwilliam Darcy prided himself on his ability to keep his emotions under good regulation, and to present himself at his best, under any circumstance. He now had reason to wonder if this pride was misplaced. This was unknown territory for him, and he was not aware of how to proceed. To his mortification, he had carelessly crossed the boundaries of his own preset limits, of what constituted the appropriate amount of interest to show a woman. He never wanted to inspire expectations in a lady, and his first inclination was to fear that he had done so. He immediately dropped his eyes to the floor, wondering if it were possible to crawl under the carpets and hide from this humiliation. "Mr. Darcy, are you well?" As he lifted his eyes to look at her, he noticed that she had closed her book, keeping one finger inside to mark her place. When his eyes made the leap from her book to her face, he saw her right eyebrow raised, as if to quiz him for his actions. Quickly setting his book aside, he cleared his throat and leapt to his feet, crossing over to stand in front of the window with his back to her. Little did he realise that this blocked the sunlight, as his shadow was cast across the same lap that he had just been caught staring at. It was a pose that he often presented when in company with those he was uncomfortable with. This would not do. I will never gain her attention by standing about in this manner. Clearing his throat again, to remove the giant mothball that seemed to have settled there, he addressed her with a confident bluntness that was, for him, all a show. "Miss Elizabeth, I thank you for asking. I am well." And that was it, the complete extent of all that came to mind. At least his inbred manners had allowed him that much speech. He desperately wanted to find the words to adequately explain himself, but fear of giving a woman of such inferior circumstances encouragement clogged his brain, and nothing close to intelligent verbiage came to him. Bowing slightly, he looked to her again, as if in hopes that she would rescue him and his clumsy efforts at an explanation. With relief, he listened as she spoke again. "Mr. Darcy, I notice that you too are reading Hamlet. Is it a favourite of yours?" She spoke in such a way that he was able to form a ready answer. "Yes. No. Could it be any worse? Yes, I am indeed reading Hamlet, and no, it is not my favourite. I much prefer Shakespeare's comedies." Darcy was somewhat proud of his answer, or proud that he had given an answer. "Comedy, Mr. Darcy?" He could see the mesmerising twinkle of her eyes, and hear the mirth in her voice. He was almost undone. "I would not have guessed you to be a lover of comedy." "And why would you say that, Miss Bennet?" Darcy walked back and sat in the leather chair that he had only moments ago vacated. During those few steps, he realised that his struggles were over. He had made a decision, and once done, there was nothing to do but proceed. Thinking of how to frame the offer of courtship almost stopped his brain completely. He struggled to recall the current point of conversation. His relief when it finally came to him was palpable. "Is it such a challenge for you to imagine that the lighter side of life would have an appeal to me?" Elizabeth Bennet settled her back into the settee and wondered at this man in front of her. Light was not a word that came to her mind when she thought of Fitzwilliam Darcy. His pride, his arrogance, and his selfish disdain for the feelings of others caused offence each time she had been in his company. From the first time that her eyes had met his, she had felt the blow of his harsh words. Tolerable, not handsome enough. Yes, she had heard the words, and they had pierced to the depths of her soul. Her nature did not allow the slight to become permanently engraved on her heart. Thus she had laughed it off, or so she had thought. However, the fact that it was so easily recalled to her memory indicated that it was indelibly carved inside her, and Elizabeth knew that this was the last man on earth that she would ever be prevailed upon to seek friendship with. "Yes, Mr. Darcy, it is a surprise to me for a certainty." She also set her book alongside her and tilted her head in question. "However, I believe that the salient point that needs to be addressed is your reason for staring at me so. Do I have dust on my nose or on my cheek?" His eyes were uncontrollably drawn to those places. His face burned a scarlet hue. "No, Miss Elizabeth, there is no dust on your face." Suddenly Darcy longed for a drink of anything to ease his parched throat. He rose and went to the open library door and requested tea from the footman, who stood outside. Darcy breathed deeply of the air in the hallway, feeling that somehow it was less stifling than that in the room. Realistically, he knew that it was only his imagination that made it thus. Having an idea, he walked briskly back into the room to the window and proceeded to lift the sill to let the cool air come in. "It is exceedingly warm, is it not?" He felt quite clever with this move. Elizabeth looked out the window to the trees bending and the leaves dancing on the stiff breeze. She could not hide the shiver that shook her and the goosebumps that immediately appeared on her arms. She moved to wrap her shawl tighter around her as Mr. Darcy turned and noticed her actions. "Will it never end? Can I do nothing right?" Darcy closed the window with a resounding thud, and then stood with his head raised, eyes closed, and hands fisted at his sides. He wished that he would be struck as invisible, or that time would turn backwards, so he did not find himself in such a muddle. "I offer my apologies, Miss Elizabeth." He shook his head as he opened his eyes and gazed down at her again. Resolution hit him as he realised that some explanations were in order. He knew not where to begin. "I was feeling the need for air. I just did not realise that we would be getting quite so much of it at once." "Mr. Darcy," Elizabeth quickly interjected. She could see that he was uncomfortable and wondered what had happened to this man. He was acting so out of the character she had sketched that she worried he had taken ill. "Again, I have to ask, are you well?" "Miss Elizabeth, I find myself discomposed, and I am making an effort to find my way out of it." It was hard to be so honest, but he felt that she deserved no less. "Might I help you, sir?" She looked so sincere, and he remembered her kindness, in spite of the insults that Caroline Bingley had thrown at her after dinner the night before, and the kindness she had shown in walking the 3 miles from Longbourn to Netherfield Park to care for her beloved sister. He also recalled the kindness and defence of her good friend, Charlotte Lucas, at her own mother's insult to her at Lucas Lodge. He felt unworthy of her kindness. "Miss Elizabeth." He looked directly into her eyes and marvelled at the colour, which was almost hidden by the dark forest of lashes. "My reason for discomfort is you." His bluntness caused an immediate reaction in her. She gathered her book to her chest, holding it to her like a shield, and started to rise. He knew that she was quitting the room, and that was the last thing he wanted her to do. He had been offered this opportunity of having her alone, where the demands of propriety were met by the open door and the servant in close proximity.
"Please stay."
The words were quiet, yet forceful in their intensity. She sat.
"I am sorry. I need to explain myself, and again, I apologize if I have caused offence."
He gently shook his head. Darcy could not remember the last time that he had offered so many apologies in so short a time, and suspected that never in his adult life would have been the right of it.
"Miss Elizabeth, I sit before you a man with a dilemma I do not know how to solve, and I believe that you are the only person who might be able to help me."
Darcy had no clue that the look he gave her was so pleading, as if he was on a precipice and needed someone to return him to safety. Elizabeth wondered at this confession. She never would have guessed that he was the type of man to display weakness so readily. It did not fit with her opinion of him. She could not imagine that she could have been that wrong about his basic character. "Please be assured that I will give whatever assistance that I am able, sir." Her curiosity was piqued as she saw him dip his head down and clasp his hands between his knees. She had never seen him so vulnerable. It seemed like a lifetime before he raised his head and startled her with the words that proceeded out of his mouth.
"Miss Elizabeth, I have reached the age of 27 without finding a woman with whom I could spend more than just a few minutes."
Before he could take a breath, he watched anger flare in her eyes. "I see your point, Mr. Darcy, and I apologize for being so long in the library." Elizabeth was livid. How dare the man? It was not his home. Mr. Bingley had generously offered his library for use while she was caring for her sister Jane. Even Miss Bingley, who barely was civil to her, had given Elizabeth permission. Mr. Darcy had no right to forbid her presence, even if it made him uncomfortable. Again she stood to leave. Darcy stood as well, horrified that Elizabeth had apparently taken his words so wrong. Would they never be able to understand one another clearly? Before she could move far away from the settee, he blurted out, his voice possibly firmer than he intended.
"Miss Elizabeth, do not go."
He softened the command with a plea. "Please." Elizabeth was angry and confused. Did he not just clearly state that he could not spend more than a few minutes in my presence? She stopped with her back turned to him, arms held stiffly at her side. Without turning to face him, she inquired, "Why?" It was one word, simply stated, yet it moved him to reveal his heart to her.
"You must allow me to tell you how ardently I admire you, Miss Elizabeth."
The words fell into silence, neither of them aware of the clock continuing to tick. Emotions churned inside Darcy's chest, until he rubbed at his heart, as if to relieve the discomfort. They were words he never had imagined he would utter in his lifetime. The weight of his responsibilities did not allow for taking on the added task of tending to a wife, so his plan had been to allow his sister to provide the heir to Pemberley after she wed. But it was done, and the relief he finally allowed himself to feel lifted his burdened heart. He looked to her back, her spine stiff and rigid. She must be stunned at his words. He imagined her delight in hearing that she would be the recipient of his favour. It would be a welcome match for her and her family. Elizabeth's sisters were poorly dowered, and the family estate was entailed to a distant cousin. Darcy was pleased that he could provide the opportunity to elevate them in society, though the thought of appearing anywhere with Mrs. Bennet and the 3 youngest siblings was appalling. Elizabeth must be overjoyed at the thought of leaving her childhood home, the vulgar conduct of her mother, and the smallness of Longbourn society behind. He would open a whole new world of opportunity for his Elizabeth. Stately homes, fine gowns, travel, and heirloom jewellery that he could envision surrounding her delicate neck, ears, wrists and fingers. Without turning around, she responded, her voice deliberate. "I believed you to think that I was only tolerable, not handsome enough to tempt you, sir. Is that not the opinion you expressed only weeks ago?" Darcy felt like Gentleman Jackson had struck him in the gut. He bent forward, bracing his hands on his knees, and gasped for air, his composure gone. He stood up and slapped his forehead in stupidity, groaning aloud at his blunder. She had heard. What could he possibly do to fix this mess of his own making? Chapter 3. Confrontation. As the moments stretched, Elizabeth waited for an answer that she assumed was not going to come. Her anger had always been like a match, quick to flare and quick to burn out. As her vexation dissipated like a morning mist, curiosity filled her until it far exceeded her ire. What could Mr. Darcy mean by claiming he admired me? She most certainly did not hold the man in esteem. He had been brusque, argumentative, and his condescension bordered on rudeness. All of the wealth in England would never persuade her to accept a courtship from such an opinionated man. She continued to face the library door. Darcy knew not how to proceed. He did know that speaking to the back of her head was not the wisest. He needed to be able to read her expression, if possible.
Miss Elizabeth, if you would permit me the opportunity of an explanation, I feel that I would be able to provide an adequate answer to your query.
He circled to the front of her, and his heart dropped when she refused to meet his eyes. Darcy had long admired her boldness and her ease amongst company. To see her hesitant in front of him unsettled him greatly. Darcy heard the approach of a servant, balancing a tray filled with a tea service, plates and rattling cups. He briefly closed his eyes in relief, grateful for the distraction, as he turned to the doorway and spotted Mrs. Nichols, Bingley's housekeeper. Following her was one of the new maids, to oversee the settling of the service onto a small table in between two large chairs placed in front of the fire, where Elizabeth could easily pour out, if she would. He waited until the women left the room, making sure they did not inadvertently close the door behind themselves. As much as he longed for her, Darcy would never do anything to compromise Elizabeth. He knew, with a confidence that surprised him, that she would never lower herself, like so many ladies of the temps, to finagle him into a position where he would be forced to offer for her. She had far too much dignity and grace of manner to stoop to such disguise. He would do anything to make peace with Elizabeth, including humbling himself before her.
Please, Miss Elizabeth, might you be seated and partake of some refreshment?
Darcy's position in society was so elevated that it would have been a degradation to lower himself, but he easily recalled the few times that his own mother counselled him before her death. He was to treat a woman's heart as precious and valuable, worth grovelling for if necessary. For if a lady generously gives her heart to a man that she holds in respect, there could be no greater treasure in all the kingdoms of the earth. To return the gift was to admire and respect her. The results would be a union where they held each other in loving regard, and they would be blessed with happy years of contentment. He also remembered the times that his father, a powerful man, gave due consideration to his wife, listening to her and, on occasion, requesting her opinion and assistance. It appeared to add to the solidity of the marriage, and Darcy suddenly realised that the key to his parents' good marriage was communication. If he wanted to progress towards a union with Elizabeth, he was going to have to learn to talk to her, a genuine exchange of ideas, and he was going to have to become a good listener. Darcy waited until Elizabeth turned and walked to the chair. She tucked her skirt behind her as she lowered herself and began to pour. He was unsurprised when his cup of tea was just as he liked it, 1 sugar and no cream. She handed him the cup without raising her eyes. Fixing her own beverage, she sat at the front of the chair, as if she was ready to jump up and run. He waited until she took her first sip, and placed her cup back on the dish.
Miss Elizabeth, I owe you an apology. I did say those words, but I did not mean them.
He was unsurprised to see her eyes flash at him, and her brow lift in amazement. He spoke in low tones, so the footman outside the door would not be privy to their conversation.
I had just arrived in Hertfordshire earlier that day, after an exhausting trip, and I was in no mood for company. I do not perform well in front of those who are not acquaintances, and a weighty family matter had left me disturbed. When Bingley tried to press me into dancing, I had not even looked to see of whom he spoke. So I apologise for saying something so untrue in your hearing. But more so, I apologise that I chose my words poorly and caused needless pain. As an explanation of my sour mood that evening, I offer you the following.
Darcy knew he was taking a risk by sharing his family pain. However, if he was permitted to pursue a courtship, it needed to be based on trust. Elizabeth deserved to know why he had acted in a manner she found offensive.
Miss Elizabeth, my only surviving family member is my young sister Georgiana. She is not yet 16 years of age. This summer she was preyed upon by a man who had been raised in my home, the son of Mr. Wickham, the steward of Pemberley. While the father was a good man, the son, whom my own father indulged, became despicable in his habits. His debauchery led to his downfall, and his sudden need for funds moved him to use his charms, which are many, and approach my sister in an effort to convince her that she loved him. With the help of her traitorous companion, Mrs. Young, he convinced her to elope to Gretna Green.
Elizabeth gasped at hearing this, covering her opened mouth with her right hand. Her own youngest sister, Lydia, was the same age as Miss Darcy, and had little sense. She could only suspect how Lydia would react under the skilled hands of a scoundrel. It would cause a ruination of the family. Lydia had the benefit of 2 parents and 4 sisters to attempt to corral her selfish inclinations. Miss Darcy must have felt so alone. "Sir, is she well?" Elizabeth was almost frantic. Did she come to harm? She tried to recall the comments that Miss Bingley had made about Darcy's sister. An elopement had not been mentioned.
I was scheduled to arrive in Ramsgate, where an establishment had been set up for Georgiana, the day of the proposed elopement. However, my business concluded sooner than I had hoped, and I was anxious to see my sister. I arrived a day early to find Wickham in the cottage with her. They had been left alone.
It was then that Elizabeth really looked at Darcy. His firm grip on the teacup threatened to shatter it, and the pain in his eyes was devastating to witness. She reached over and removed the cup from his hands, placing it back on the tray. Darcy immediately clasped his hands together until she could see the white of his knuckles. They were large hands, with long, thick fingers, and Elizabeth could see they had calluses. Here was a man unafraid of hard work. His shoulders were broad, and his arms appeared strong under her hand, the few times that she had taken his arm. He was a tall man, who was almost bent and broken as he looked at the floor. Without looking up, he again began speaking.
When I asked him his intentions, Georgiana heard Wickham claim that his only interest in my sister was her dowry of £30,000. It almost broke her to realise both how he had played upon her tender feelings and the shame that her actions almost brought on the Darcy name.
He sat back in the chair and rested his head on the backrest, the first time that she had ever seen his posture less than upright.
Miss Elizabeth, you can understand how it pains my own heart to feel powerless to help Georgiana. She has had no mother, no older sister to guide her, only a brother who knew not how to help her heart to heal.
Finally, he sat up in his normal position and gazed upon her.
It was that man, that failure as a guardian and older brother, who spoke so carelessly at the Meryton Assembly, Miss Elizabeth.
He watched her for her reaction, but could find no evidence of emotion other than shock in her expression or her eyes.
It has been many weeks since I considered you the handsomest woman of my acquaintance.
He was done. There were no words left for him to share. He had confessed it all. Elizabeth had absorbed his words, and was processing them syllable by syllable. She understood the compliment that he offered, both by declaring his feelings for her and for sharing the account of his sister. If it became known, it would ruin Miss Darcy. She would be prevented from being presented at court, She would receive no coveted voucher to attend the balls at Almack's, and her chance of making a good marriage was gone. Finally she spoke. Darcy could not take his eyes off her. Her tone was as soft as his, as she assured him that she would respect the privacy of both brother and sister. "Mr. Darcy, my heart aches for your sister." And she realised that her heart ached a bit for him too. Her prejudice towards him had been rooted in false impressions. This was not the man that she thought he was. "I now understand how your emotions may have got away from you that night, but I believe that your comment created resentment in me that I have been pleased to hang on to, not to my credit." As he watched her, he realised that never before had he wanted to hold a woman's hand. Before he could stop himself, his arm stretched out, as if to take her hand in his, to feel the softness, to intertwine their fingers, and to join her palm to his own. Her next words stopped his forward movement. "Might I ask how long you have had guardianship over your sister?" He seemed such a solitary man, and she wondered at the relationship between the Darcy siblings. The difference in their ages, and his unfamiliarity with the emotional vacillation of a young female mind, must have been a considerable challenge. For that, she could easily give him the benefit of overlooking his offensive speech.
"We lost my mother at Georgiana's birth, and my father died 5 years ago. I share guardianship with our cousin, Colonel Fitzwilliam. However, his career of active service to the Crown keeps him away for long periods of time, so the task, most generally, falls to me." "Please, sir, would you tell me about your sister? I understand from Miss Bingley's comments that she is a paragon of accomplishment." She chuckled. Darcy's relief at seeing the twinkle return to her eyes was like cool water to a thirsty man. He told how Georgiana loved music, enjoyed long rides racing across the grassy fields of Pemberley, and despised mathematics and science. She was timid and reticent in company. Elizabeth compared it to the boldness of Lydia, and realised that they were complete opposites. The description called to mind her eldest sister Jane. Jane Bennet was all that was good and kind, quietly going about her tasks, with efficiency and calm. "Sir, my sister Jane was approached by a gentleman in London when she was the same age that Miss Darcy is now. The interest he showed encouraged her heart to attach itself to him. When he left, it almost broke that tender heart. I easily remember how long it took for her to recover, but recover she did." Elizabeth had been deeply concerned for her sister. It had taken months to overcome the terrible pain in Jane's heart. 13-year-old Lizzie vowed that she would never give an inferior man power over her, and that she would never marry unless there was evident love and respect between both parties. Mr. Darcy was a puzzle that intrigued her. Elizabeth had seen no evidence of tender affection on Darcy's part at all. Darcy knew that Bingley was attracted to Miss Bennet, as he had long tired of hearing about his friend's angel. He considered how his contemplation of Miss Jane Bennet, at the few social events they had all attended, had led him to think that Jane had no real attachment to Bingley. This information helped Darcy realise that his conclusions were undoubtedly wrong. Darcy was grateful that he had not tried to talk Bingley out of his pursuit of his angel by indicating that her affections were not engaged. He desperately hoped Georgiana would, like Jane Bennet, recover over time. His arrogant, foolish self. How wrong he would have been to direct Bingley away from Miss Bennet. It would have been painful to them both, and it would cause great hurt to Elizabeth. His pride in his understanding of those around him was taking a beating. Chapter 4. Challenge. They quietly sipped their tea as they contemplated all that had been revealed. It was much to take in. Both had failed to see the true feelings that the other carried for them, and both had failed to see that their own feelings were distorted by both pride and prejudice. "Mr. Darcy, sir." Elizabeth watched Darcy as he opened and closed the hand that rested on his left thigh. In every other way, he appeared to be calm. For some reason, that clue,
That signal that he was not as composed as she had assumed him always to be was a comfort to her. He had unsettled her with his words, and now she knew they were on an even keel. In such cases as this, it is, I believe, the established mode to express a sense of obligation for the sentiments avowed, however unequally they may be returned. It is natural that obligation should be felt, and since I do feel gratitude, I would now thank you. You have quite caught me by surprise, Mr. Darcy." Darcy was flummoxed. He could see the sincerity in her manner and expression, so he had no cause to doubt her.
"Excuse me, but you were not expecting my address?"
How could she not? He had felt many times over the course of her stay at Netherfield Park that his attentions were quite obvious. He had thought that she was flirting with him. Caroline Bingley had noticed, to the point that her jealousy moved her to make personal attacks on Elizabeth's character. She was not flirting. "I was not, sir." Elizabeth shook her head, as if to clear her vision and her thinking. "It was my opinion, Mr. Darcy, that you disapproved of me. Your looks appeared to censure and find fault with my appearance, my speech, and my conduct. Our arguments seemed to fuel the dissension that I felt between us. I had no expectations of you at all." It was as if her words slapped him, with vigour. He sat stunned. "Sir," she continued, surprised by his discomposure, "are you well?"
"I was not finding fault with you, Miss Elizabeth."
He ran his hand through his hair, upset that she had misread his intentions.
Had my conduct been so poor?
Darcy's affections were completely engaged, but he knew that they had not always been. Her circumstances had caused him no end of consternation.
Had she been able to look beyond his mask, to see his struggle? "Indeed, I have had no end of difficulty in keeping my composure when in your company. Simply put, Miss Elizabeth, you entrance me."
"But the argument, sir—" She continued to be perplexed. Most often our conversations resulted in disagreements that others in this household found to be uncomfortable. There have been very few times that we have reached an agreement. Could you possibly believe that there could be felicity between us, if this is our want?"
"Miss Elizabeth, I agree that our debates were lively, and I relish those discussions. Did you not also?"
"Well, yes, I suppose that I did. Thinking of them as taking the form of a debate sheds new light on those discussions." Elizabeth pondered this line of thinking. True, she frequently engaged in similar debates with her father, over a variety of subjects, often taking a position that was opposite his, solely for the sake of furthering the conversation. Had Mr. Darcy been doing that as well? Elizabeth was not surprised at his intelligence. He was, after all, a graduate of Cambridge. It had been her father's university, and though she knew that she would never be allowed the privilege of being educated in those hallowed halls, she did long to benefit from all the gentlemen had learned. "So you were not endeavouring to display your superiority of understanding when we spoke?"
"I was not."
All of a sudden, comprehension hit Darcy like a blow.
"You thought that I was speaking down to you, then?"
"I did." Apparently they reached the same conclusion at the same time. What she had enjoyed learning in her father's library, and viewed as an opportunity to best Darcy in debate, he had enjoyed sparring with her in equal measure. "Oh." Darcy went back over her response to his revelation of his admiration to her. She claimed that their feelings were unequal. Elizabeth's further dialogue clearly indicated that she had not viewed him favourably, and would reject his suit should he actually make an offer. His heart hurt.
"Miss Elizabeth, I now understand your feelings most clearly."
She interrupted him. "But how could you possibly, when I realise that I do not understand them at all?" Who was this man? Darcy no longer seemed to fit in the confined box that she had placed him in. Yes, he still wore his pride, like his greatcoat, that kept inclement weather off his clothing. But like that garment, it seemed that this pride served as a protection to him. It was a completely new way of viewing the man. He loved his sister, and suffered for her broken heart. He had as his best friend one of the most amiable men that Elizabeth had met, and he was apparently willing to overlook how her position in society compared to his. Again, she wondered, who was this man?
"What are you saying, Miss Elizabeth?"
Darcy was afraid to hope, yet it started flickering in his heart as he gazed upon her tenderly. She was all that was beautiful and appealing to him. As their time in the library passed, his affection for her grew. She was a woman like no other of his acquaintance. Elizabeth thought carefully how she would word her answer. She did not want to give him hope, if there was none. Yet her emotions were roiling, like the eddy that swirled around and around the creek at high water. "Sir, you are correct when you assumed that I love a debate. I admire a man who can hold his own, and even best me on occasion." She was surprised at his chuckle, a sound foreign to her ears. He was most handsome when he smiled, the kind of handsome that made taking more than one breath in a row a challenge. This new approachability made it easier for what she had to say. "I am ashamed to admit that I have suffered from an overabundance of pride myself. For as long as I can remember, I have allowed my first impressions to rule my attitude and conduct towards others. It is difficult for me to admit that I might have been in error. If I have been so with you, might I not have also been unfairly judgmental with others? It is a matter of shame that I have been so unaware of my own limitations."
"Please do not be so hard on yourself, Miss Elizabeth. You are not the first to imply that my reticence translated as arrogance. None of this was your fault."
Darcy had not realized he was holding his breath until he exhaled before speaking. Her modesty, coupled with her intelligence and concern for others, would make her shine as mistress of Pemberley. He thought back on how she had attempted to corral the boisterousness of her younger sisters and steer them to better conduct, and realized that she was the perfect sister to his own. He knew then that he had much to repair with Elizabeth, and he vowed to start now.
"May we agree to begin again, Miss Elizabeth?"
She gave this question careful thought. There was a part of her heart that rejoiced in his admiration. He was a great man in England, and the thought that he had chosen her, ahead of the debutantes of society, and Caroline Bingley, was balm to her. They had much more to bring to a courtship: wealth, position, titles. She had only her charms to recommend her, and Elizabeth admitted to herself that she had made no effort to use those charms on Mr. Darcy. "Mr. Darcy, we are two people with strong personalities, would you not agree?" At his nod, she continued, "It might be the greatest challenge that either of us has undertaken, but I am willing to start again. The least that can happen is that we will be left with a friend. That is the most I can promise at this time." He rejoiced. He had hope, and he loved a challenge. Chapter 5. Caroline. Miss Caroline Bingley was feeling very satisfied with the events of the day. Miss Jane Bennet was confined to the upstairs guest bedchamber with ill health that would keep her from her brother Charles's presence. Miss Elizabeth Bennet had been all but ignored by Mr. Darcy this morning at the breakfast table. Elizabeth had absented herself from the company that Netherfield Park offered during the afternoon, which delighted Caroline. There was no telling where Elizabeth had disappeared to. Most likely she was wandering the prettyish kind of little wilderness surrounding the estate, and would return with her hem covered 6 inches deep in mud, and her hair blown into a frazzle. This thought delighted Caroline, and she smirked at the thought of Darcy discovering his favourite in that condition. The past 2 days had seen Darcy and Elizabeth often in conversation, to the exclusion of the others in the household. This had been a source of extreme irritation and worry to Caroline. It was Caroline's purpose to have Mr. Darcy observe her skills as an elegant hostess, as an attractive companion, and as the future mistress of Pemberley in Derbyshire, Mr. Darcy's ancestral home. Any interference from the Bennet sisters was not to be borne. Mr. Darcy was a handsome man, with a commanding presence. He had wealth, and his family name was powerful. In Caroline Bingley's mind, there was no better match for her to be had.
She had no clue as to the gentleman's feelings on the matter, nor did his feelings matter to her overmuch. It was the end result that was her goal. Miss Elizabeth was firmly standing in her way, and Caroline was resolute in crushing any attraction between the two. It had been after Miss Elizabeth had retired upstairs the night before that the campaign to remind Charles and Mr. Darcy of the poor qualifications of the Bennet sisters to be amongst such elevated society had begun. "Eliza Bennet," said Miss Bingley, when the door was closed on Elizabeth, as she returned upstairs to care for her sister, "is one of those young ladies who seek to recommend themselves to the other sex by undervaluing their own, and with many men, I dare say, it succeeds. But in my opinion it is a paltry device, a very mean art."
"Undoubtedly," replied Darcy, to whom this remark was chiefly addressed. "There is a meanness in all the arts which ladies sometimes condescend to employ for captivation. Whatever bears affinity to cunning is despicable." Caroline, in her arrogance, had no clue that Mr. Darcy was referring to her as he expressed his opinion. His apparent agreement with her conclusions fuelled her elevated opinion of herself. It was now time to put the next step of her plan into action. Caroline was confident that her words from the night before had planted serious doubts in Mr. Darcy's mind about the suitability of continuing acquaintance with someone so below him. He would be right for her to step in and smooth his transition from the undeserving Elizabeth Bennet to the extremely deserving Caroline. Darcy was astonished at all that Elizabeth had revealed about her inner thoughts and feelings. Yes, he could concur that they both had strong personalities. It was one of the many things that appealed to him about her. From there, it was an easy step for him to visualize the future, where they might have periods of passionate disagreements, followed by periods of passionate atonement. He had not realized that the smile he was feeling on the inside had transmitted itself to his face. Elizabeth gazed at him in wonder. Until this time in the library, she had viewed him as unable to be anything but sombre. The change in his facial features was magnificent. That Darcy could look on the follies and foibles of humanity with pleasure, rather than disdain, was shocking to her. Yet it pleased her to find that, in this one thing, she had been blatantly wrong. Noticing that he had emptied his teacup, she again poured it. 1 sugar and no cream. The sound of the clock ticking, and the need to speak in hushed tones, had again taken their rightful place in the library. The storm had settled, and the period of tranquillity was welcomed. Unbeknownst to both Darcy and Elizabeth, Caroline Bingley had arrived outside the door. The russet-headed woman stopped and smoothed her hair, pinched her cheeks, and, taking both hands, quickly lifted her breasts from underneath to mound over the top of her plunging neckline. Her assets screamed to be shown to their greatest advantage. Only the footman was eyewitness to her grooming. It took the utmost diligence not to indicate by his facial expression that he had, or had not, enjoyed the sight. Caroline had known that Darcy was typically found in the library most afternoons. There would be no one to interrupt them. When she entered the room, she could see the side of his head, towering over the back of the chair that faced the fireplace on the right. His cup and saucer were on the table, and she easily imagined him absorbed with a book in his hand. The side of his face was partially turned to her, and she was captivated by the welcoming smile on his profile. He must have heard my approach. It was heartwarming to comprehend that he recognized the light, elegant tapping of her steps, as she floated across the marble floors from the drawing-room to the library. He is all anticipation. Mr. Darcy, she purred, dropping her voice, and rolling the R of his surname. Distracted by the beautiful woman in front of him, Darcy failed to hear Caroline's approach. At her greeting, he jumped to his feet and turned to face her. Not wanting Caroline to know that Elizabeth was seated across from him, he stepped between the 2 wing-back chairs and bowed. He had noticed Elizabeth's head pivot toward the sound, but she had not moved from her position, other than to pull the cup and saucer she was holding closer to her. The large chair hid her tiny form. "Miss Bingley, how may I be of service?" Darcy focused his gaze just over Caroline's left shoulder to the doorway. He refused to allow his eyes to linger anywhere on her person. "Oh, come now, Mr. Darcy." Caroline lightened her voice as she walked closer. She was thrilled to see Darcy taking the steps to meet her in the middle of the room. Her plan of being alone with him was working out better than she had imagined. "We have been friends far too long to stand on ceremony. You may call me Caroline, or if you are feeling affectionate, Caro." In her dreams, as he drew close for their first kiss, he softly whispered, "Caro." She almost shivered in expectation.
"Miss Bingley, I ask again, how may I be of service?"
Darcy was frustrated that his time alone with Elizabeth had been interrupted. He felt like he had made some progress, both in determining his feelings and in determining hers. "Mr. Darcy, I have long known that we are perfect for each other." She took another step towards Darcy. One more step and they would almost touch, her chest to his. She felt warmth creeping up her torso and an itch in the palm of her hands. One more step, and she could cup his cheeks and run her hands to the back of his head to capture the locks that rested on the back of his neck, curled in invitation. Her breathing became shallow. "Our being united in marriage would give you what you always wanted. Me as your wife, and Charles as your brother. We are destined for each other." Enraptured by her own words and imagination, she made a bold leap forward, catching him around the neck with both arms. Caroline did not expect what happened next.
"Miss Bingley."
Darcy grabbed her arms, and in a move reminiscent of his childhood struggles with his cousin Richard Fitzwilliam, twisted her until Caroline's arm was behind her back, and she was facing the library entrance. Before the adrenaline could settle, he marched her to the library doorway, pushed her through and closed the door firmly behind her. Darcy bowed his head, with his forehead resting on the hard oak surface of the door, as he identified Caroline's shrieks and stomping feet moving up the main staircase to the family quarters. It took long moments before his breathing returned to normal. Completely unnoticed was the grin on the usually passive face of the footman. Darcy shook his head in confusion, feeling the wood grind into his forehead. He wanted to bash it into the hardwood, over and over. How had Caroline Bingley ever come to think that I would return her affection? It was not until he stepped back from the door and inhaled and exhaled with force that he heard the light sound of Elizabeth's laughter.
What am I going to do now?
Chapter 6. Clarification. Darcy turned slowly until he faced the fireplace. Elizabeth was peeking around the chair, only her eyes and the top of her head visible. He was captivated by those eyes. They sparkled with laughter, and he knew that in his lifetime he had never seen anything as lovely. Elizabeth pointed the index finger of her left hand around the chair to a point beyond Darcy. He looked behind him, realised the door was closed, and hurriedly turned to right the situation. It would not do to compromise Miss Elizabeth. He respected her too much to do so, and he loved her enough to not force her into a situation not of her choosing. As he opened the door, Darcy happened to catch the eye of the attending footman. Embarrassment flooded both men at the spectacular showing Miss Bingley had provided. Darcy knew not what would transpire downstairs once the footman had repeated the account of the afternoon's activities. Surely it would not be to Miss Bingley's advantage. Darcy doubted that she was well liked by the servants of Netherfield Park. When the footman gave him a quick wink, causing the heat to flare under Darcy's collar, Darcy shrugged his shoulder in a "what is a man to do" fashion. He walked back into the library, the door now wide open. He was able to maintain his composure as he sat back in his chair. Staring at the fire in front of him, he sought to put his thoughts in order. He knew that to gaze at Elizabeth would be to invite distraction. He had never used brute force on a female, ever. That he had done so, even under such provocation, was abhorrent to him. He worried that once Elizabeth's mirth had passed, she would worry about his character.
He was not a violent man. Certainly, in his youth, it was common for his Fitzwilliam cousins to join with him and George Wickham in rough play that sometimes resulted in bruises, scrapes and cuts. As they grew into their teenage years, they practised boxing and wrestling skills as often as they practised fencing and marksmanship. It was Richard Fitzwilliam that had taught him the particular hold he had used on Caroline. Darcy had always believed Richard had learned it at the hands of his older brother. Darcy closed his eyes, suddenly horrified. It had only been the month prior that he had bent Richard's arm behind his back to prevent him from absconding with a cherished bottle of French brandy. Darcy had stockpiled a few bottles before the embargo, and he only had 2 left. The cousins had been at Darcy House in London, and Richard had been caught red-handed. Richard was tall and well-muscled. He most likely weighed close to 14 stone. Caroline Bingley was about half his size and weight. If that hold was enough to stop Richard from pilfering, Darcy knew beyond doubt that he had hurt Caroline. His shame knew no bounds. "Mr. Darcy, I cannot guess what is going on in your mind, but I do believe that you are chastising yourself for your actions. Am I correct?" The expressions that were crossing his face were almost painful to watch. Without looking at Elizabeth, Darcy nodded his head slowly. "Then you need to stop right now." He could not recall a time when a woman had spoken to him in such a manner, and was surprised that his immediate response was petulant. How very mature of me. It bothered Elizabeth to see such a man torturing himself because of actions that were just, and it bothered her that it was Mr. Darcy who was stirring up these emotions. Do I truly care so much that he is upset? "Elizabeth, you need to understand the kind of man I am, the kind of man that I have long desired to be." In his distress, he failed to realise that he had used her Christian name. It was one more fault that he, most likely, would later add to his sins, upon reflection of this time spent in the library. Darcy had never tried to put these emotions into words, and was having difficulty sorting them out. Gratefully, Elizabeth allowed him that time. "My father was an excellent man. His sterling reputation of being a faithful husband, a loyal friend, an efficient master, and a caring father gave me the standard that I wanted to grow up to be." He was staring at the fire, a look that Elizabeth now knew was one of concentration rather than reproach. She no longer felt disturbed at seeing his eyes so engaged. She caught him running both hands through his hair, and realised he often did that when he was unsettled. She was coming to know the man. "It was not that I merely wanted to be like my father, Miss Elizabeth. I wanted to be that kind of man, because I knew that it was the best way to be. I had been raised with fine principles that would never allow for deliberately causing pain and suffering." Darcy paused, as if having particular difficulty choosing his next words. "I have never admired Miss Bingley in the way that she desires me to. It is a matter of fact that I have viewed her attempts to attract my attention with disdain. I now wonder if my strong reaction just now was in response to that disgust that churned inside me at her proposition, or if it was because I did not want her to intrude on our time together." Elizabeth could not take her eyes from him. This troubled man was a good man, something she had failed to recognise about him before. Though her inclination was to try to tease him out of this dark mood, she realised the inappropriateness of following that path. She determined to respond with all seriousness. "Mr. Darcy, I must ask you to look at matters from my perspective." She noticed his eyes flicker from the fire to her and back. He was listening. "Would you agree that Miss Bingley feels a strong degree of animosity towards me?" "I would." "And would you also agree that she would have been extremely agitated had she found out that I was an unwelcome eavesdropper on her offer to you?" "I would."
"And, sir, would you agree that her agitation would have been heightened even more had she been aware that we were alone in conversation in her library?"
"I believe so, Miss Elizabeth."
"Then what do you think her conduct would be towards me, and possibly my tender-hearted sister, if she somehow became aware of that fact while we are still here at Netherfield Park?" Darcy thought about that. The series of questions that Elizabeth systematically expounded provided clarity. He knew then what she was about.
Miss Elizabeth, before I provide you an answer to your final question, I would appreciate hearing your impression of these events.
At this point, Darcy felt a glimmer of hope in his breast that had grown slightly since just before Caroline had entered the room. He realised that the pain in his heart had been the certainty that the flame had been snuffed out. Darcy finally looked at Elizabeth and was mesmerised as she chewed on her bottom lip in thought. Longing to soothe that lip with his own almost overpowered him. He was distracted when she started to speak, so intense was his gaze on her mouth. To Elizabeth, she noticed for the first time the chocolate warmth of his eyes as she saw where his gaze dwelt. Her body reacted automatically. She sucked the bottom corner of her lip into her mouth and slowly let it out, not realising the effect it would have on him, until she heard his sharp intake of breath. It was an impossible feat for her to not be touched by the depth of his admiration. That he would put her interests before someone that he had been in company with for years, someone with all the accomplishments of a lady of the temps, dowered with £20,000, was incredible to her. Finally, the scales that had blinded her to the worth of this man fell from her eyes, and she clearly saw what was before her. She did not love him, yet her heart was far more engaged than she had anticipated. Now she longed to bring him comfort. "Sir, it appeared to me that your first reaction was to protect me, even before you replied to Miss Bingley. Your actions and your words were just. They serve to clearly proclaim to me where your heart is. I saw that principled man that you spoke of in action, Mr. Darcy. Because of this, I am assured that you would have the respect and admiration of your father, in the same way you have mine." Her words startled him, almost knocking the wind from him. He was afraid that he was delusional, that he could not have heard her correctly.
"You admire me?"
He had to ask. He had to know. "I do." Darcy reached over and clasped her hand to his, palm to palm, just as he had earlier desired.
"So, Miss Elizabeth, you admire me, and I admire you."
He spoke slowly, savouring the words. They sounded like a beautiful melody that gets caught in your brain so that it repeats over and over until you can think of nothing else. Boldly he continued,
"Miss Elizabeth, I am an impatient man. If you allow me to have my way, and to direct the events in our future, we will be wed and at my home Pemberley within the month."
He chuckled as he saw her wordlessly shaking her head back and forth, her gaze never breaking contact with his.
"I move too fast, my dear."
"Oh, yes, sir, you do." She smiled slightly as she replied. Her tone was firm, but cushioned in softness, silk and iron.
"Then may I speak to your father about a courtship, Miss Elizabeth?"
He squeezed her hand gently, as her eyes had drifted down to their joined hands. At this, she looked back up to his face. "No, Mr. Darcy, you may not." His disappointment was immediate. At her not-so-gentle squeeze, he looked back up at her. "I believe that it is the practice of a gentleman to request permission of the lady first. Is that not correct?" He spied the twinkle, and then the smile. He agreed, and then he asked. Chapter 7. Cherished. Once he had Elizabeth's acceptance, Darcy wasted no time deciding to ride to Longbourn immediately to get permission from Mr. Bennet. However, his mental momentum stopped in the same manner that a rolling ball stopped against a brick wall. Should he leave the library, there might not be an opportunity to be left alone again until they married, if indeed she would accept him when he asked. His desire for her close company was far more than his desire for Mr. Bennet's company. Darcy would speak with him on the morrow. "Mr. Darcy, you have to know that had you smiled at me the first night, as you are smiling at me now, I would have accepted your offer of courtship with haste." He had been the most striking man at the Meryton Assembly. Darcy's height, his garments, and his carriage proclaimed his elevated position in society before he had ever opened his mouth. However, open his mouth he had. Elizabeth looked at the man next to her and compared him to the gentleman she had been introduced to that night. Was he even the same man? He was not.
"Is that so, Miss Elizabeth?"
Darcy was unaware that Elizabeth could see the boyish mischief sparkling from his dark eyes.
"Then I shall smile at you at least once each day for the rest of our days on earth. Furthermore, we shall be declared the happiest man and woman in all of England. Our friends and acquaintances will bow to our affability and charm."
Elizabeth could hear the laughter in his voice. Not our condescension. Who was this playful man?
"Condescension? Me?"
Darcy drew back with his hand to his chest, and his eyebrows raised, as if he was horrified that that particular quality was in any way associated with his name. Then he laughed, really laughed. Elizabeth gazed upon him in wonder, shaking her head back and forth, with a smile on her face. She had assumed, prior to this time in the library, that Darcy did not like to get his feathers ruffled, nor engage in displays of emotion. He had appeared to be a man of routine, who staunchly wielded a shield between him and all but a select few. That he would allow her to see him unmasked and vulnerable, let her know how treasured she would be, if their courtship followed the path to its end result, marriage. She was a born feather ruffler. Darcy had to know what he was getting into, and she was more than pleased to know that he knew how to share in her joy. Darcy knew he was smiling too much. They were now sitting side by side on the settee, and he thought to return to his more dignified appearance. However, as soon as he made the attempt, he observed small frown lines between Elizabeth's brows. He smiled, and the lines went away. Darcy knew then that he wanted nothing hidden between them. For the first time in his adult life, he would be able to relax with someone other than Richard. Even with Bingley, he needed to always keep his emotions regulated. Being in Charles Bingley's company was like trying to corral a puppy. By the end of the day, he was usually worn to a frazzle. Not that he would ever admit to such, of course. He opened his mouth to declare his love to his dearest, and was amazed at what came out.
"Do you know that spending the day with Bingley wears me to a frazzle?"
Darcy's eyes opened wide, and his jaw dropped.
What had happened here?
Elizabeth put her hand to her mouth and giggled. It was a delightful refrain. "I am pleased that you would share that information with me, Mr. Darcy. While I do not have a clue as to why you felt the need, I will be able to reassure my sister of Mr. Bingley's playfulness, should she desire to know." She was laughing at him, and for the first time Darcy did not mind.
"I had just determined not to mention that particular fact when it popped out of my mouth."
He shook his head in wonder.
"I have never been so unrestrained in my speech, Miss Elizabeth, but since I am, I would like to ask permission to call you by name when we are alone. I am aware that propriety demands that we wait until an official engagement. However, you have long been Elizabeth in my mind. I now doubt that my tongue, which seems to be unhinged, will cooperate with such a restriction. It is my hope that you give me permission to have this privilege."
Elizabeth's attraction to this man was growing minute by minute. It no longer amazed her that normal courting couples took so long to come to an agreement, when they were never left alone to converse properly and with such thoroughness. This time together was a blessing. "You may call me Elizabeth, sir." She tilted her head to her shoulder slightly and raised a brow. "And what might I be allowed to call you, Mr. Darcy?"
"Certainly Mr. Darcy when we are in company. Mr. Fitzwilliam Darcy when you are upset with me. Fitzwilliam when I am distracted and you need my attention. And William when we are alone or with my close family."
He spoke slowly, his baritone voice a low rumble in his chest. Darcy squeezed the hand he had been holding since they had moved to the settee, stroking his thumb across her wrist. "This I can do, William." She leaned her head a bit towards him and heard his sharp intake of breath. "I am called Lizzie by my family and childhood friends. I am Elizabeth Bennet when I have been caught doing something that I should not. And I am Eliza to Miss Bingley." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "And when I call you my Will, what shall you call me in return?" Darcy was having a hard time getting air into his lungs. He felt his chest burning with the effort. He moved his head just a few inches forward and tilted it to the opposite side of hers. Their mouths were only a breath away.
"I will call you mine."
He closed the distance. As his lips softly rested on hers, his heart pounded fiercely, and noise thundered in his ears. It was but a moment before he realized that it was not his body responding to the kiss that was making the noise. It was the footman outside the door of the library, tapping on the door and clearing his throat to get his attention. Darcy pulled away and leaped over to the chair across from the settee as Charles Bingley sauntered into the library. All looked as it should be. Well, almost. The colour on both Darcy and Elizabeth's faces was rosy, and both were breathing shallowly. They hoped that Bingley would fail to notice. "Say, Darcy," Bingley began, completely unaware of Elizabeth's presence, or the fact that both her and Darcy's faces were bright red in embarrassment. "You do not happen to know what happened to Caroline, do you? The staff has reported to Mrs. Nichols that she's been ranting something about Miss Elizabeth and you and me never becoming brothers and possibly having strong arms. Do you know what she might be talking about?" When Darcy glanced at Elizabeth, Bingley's eyes followed, and he became aware that she was also in the library. He completely missed the fact that neither occupant was holding a book, an odd occurrence for the room they were in. "Miss Elizabeth, I apologise for interrupting your reading. Please forgive my rambling." He turned to his friend. "Darcy, might I have a word in private in my study?" It suddenly occurred to Elizabeth that she was not as much unlike Caroline Bingley as she had surmised. How horrifying! While she had considered Miss Bingley to be as dense as a stump, Elizabeth realised that she had been just as clueless. Caroline was completely unable to determine that Darcy had no interest in pursuing her for a wife. That he was interested in her, Elizabeth had not determined either. Elizabeth shuddered at the thought. Being in concert with Caroline Bingley was not something to be proud of. "No, Bingley, I do not think that we need to have this conversation in private. Miss Elizabeth observed all that occurred, and you may need to hear her testimony to corroborate my explanation." Before he had seated himself in the other chair, Bingley started with an apology. "Darcy, I can only imagine what might have happened if Caroline thought you were in here alone. She has not been subtle in her desires, and I have done nothing to curb her pursuit of you. I apologise." Bingley was his closest friend outside of his family. He was an amiable man who rarely found fault with anyone. While this was a perfect foil for Darcy's reticence, it left Bingley vulnerable to being controlled by a strong, demanding personality such as Caroline displayed. Darcy had long wished that his friend would take his errant sister under control, but he realised that the fault did not solely lie with Bingley. Why had their parents not disciplined her and counselled her in her formative years? Why had Caroline not applied herself to becoming a woman worthy of admiration, rather than demanding respect and adulation from those she deemed below her? With horrifying clarity, Darcy thought of his own conduct at Meryton. Was he really any different than Caroline Bingley? He shuddered at the thought. It was no wonder Elizabeth had not been aware of his interest. Am I worthy of her? Bingley, your sister's conduct was unseemly, and her attempt to compromise me into offering for her a failure. My heart is already engaged. He looked at Elizabeth as he spoke. Though Bingley may act foolish at times, he was not a fool. He could now see what he had not noticed before. He thought back on the conversations of the past few days between the couple, and realised that Darcy was not repulsed by Elizabeth Bennet. He was in love with her. "I did not know, Darcy. I wish you joy." Bingley's words hit Darcy like a blow. The woman he loved had not known of his affections, and his best friend had been taken completely unaware. He did not deserve her. Elizabeth could see that something was disturbing Darcy, so she thanked Bingley for his kind words. When she saw Darcy's head drop down and heard his deep sigh, she knew that she needed to do something to mend the situation. "Mr. Bingley, these feelings are very new to us, and my inclination is to hold them close to my heart for now. While we are delighted that you share in our happiness, we would hope that, for now, you would not share this information with anyone else." Though she was looking at Bingley, she saw Darcy lift his head and place his gaze directly on her. At Bingley's reassurance, she continued, "What you have long known about Mr. Darcy, I am now able to discern. He is a man of integrity and loyalty. Though he tries to hide his goodness and his kind heart, it has now been revealed to me. All of the components that make him a good friend to you have made him a man that I desire to know better." Darcy's heart, which had started to ache, now rejoiced. He knew enough of Elizabeth to know that she would not exaggerate her feelings, just to ease a situation or make someone feel better. She spoke the truth as she knew it. The comfort he felt was immense. Bingley stood and gave them a short bow. "Then I will leave you to do so." With that he moved to leave the library. Before he even reached the doorway, Darcy moved back to the settee, gathered Elizabeth in his arms, and showed her just how loved and cherished he felt. Chapter 8. Conclusion. Neither Darcy nor Elizabeth was aware of how much time passed while they were engaged in expressing their tender affections. Darcy had barely drawn away from her with the need to breathe, when the need to feel her lips against his moved him back into his now favourite position. The cough of the footman alerted Darcy that not only was someone approaching, their time was passing, and the minutes alone in the library were quickly coming to an end. At Mrs. Nicholls' entrance to remove the tea-tray, Darcy determined that the footman, that had attended them so well from his post outside the library door, needed rewarding for his diligence and discretion. Might there be a place for him at Pemberley or Darcy House in town? While the cups and saucers were being replaced on the tray, Darcy allowed himself a moment of fantasy. Her taste had been delicious. It called to mind the first time he had tasted the sweet juiciness of an orange. He had been 8 years old when his father had brought a crate of the fruit home from the docks in London. The smell was enticing. Darcy had not known what to make of the peeled sections as he ate them as fast as he could push them into his mouth. His mother had laughed at him as he told her that it was the best taste in the world. Now he knew better. His Elizabeth was far more delectable. As soon as the servants left the room, Darcy stood to move back to the settee. He was stunned when Elizabeth put her hand out, palm up, stopping him. When he continued moving forward, she moved her head from side to side and pointed the index finger of that same hand at him, shaking it vigorously. He sat. He felt like he was 8 years old again, being denied any more oranges after the last one had been devoured. "Mr. Darcy?" Darcy was not yet confident in her affections, so he was unusually anxious about what she had to say. "We have before us an opportunity. While I enjoyed how we spent the past moments, there is still much that we should discuss, since we still have some time undisturbed. Do you not agree?" He wanted to scream, no. He wanted more time. He wanted more kisses. He wanted her to wrap her arms around his neck and play with the back of his hair again. However, she was right. They needed to talk. His brain was on idle. His mind was more agreeably engaged. She said my kisses were enjoyable. He must have been smiling like a fool, because Elizabeth had to start off the topic of conversation. "William, I do believe that you will catch my father completely by surprise when you talk to him in the morning. I had not been shy in proclaiming my earlier dislike of you." When she saw Darcy stiffen in displeasure, she hurried to continue. "While you are aware that my feelings have undergone a complete reversal, my father is not. Have you given any thought to what you will say?" In truth, he had not. This whole situation was so new to him. He was decisive in business because he took the time to think through all the possibilities before acting. In this undertaking with Elizabeth, all he could think of was achieving the end goal, that of making her his wife. It was easy for him to imagine life with her at Pemberley, the halls suddenly noisy with children's laughter, and the care they would give each other with advancing age. Nevertheless, without Elizabeth's father's blessing, there would be no wedding. She would not be free to marry without it, until she reached her majority, which could be months away. "The 20th of June I will reach my majority," Elizabeth inserted, as if she could read his thoughts. He was beyond pleased that she could follow his thinking in some matters to their logical conclusion. It boded well for the future. She would be the perfect mistress of Pemberley and keeper of his heart.
"Then, might I suggest that you write to your father tonight, while you sit with your sister Jane? I can take your missive with me tomorrow for him to read, before I plead my case." At her nod, he added, "Elizabeth, I will not leave his presence until I have his permission. I will do whatever it takes to secure it."
She chuckled. "Then you had better whisper your intentions to my mother on your way into father's study. Then, and only then, will you be able to consider the matter accomplished." Darcy had never imagined any circumstance where he would be pleased with Mrs. Bennet's propensity for matchmaking. She was a silly woman, whose vulgar praise of his income in public had firmly set him against her. Yet Elizabeth knew her parents well, and all of his years practising battle strategy with his cousin, the Colonel, aided him to discern the strength in numbers. With Elizabeth's letter and Mrs. Bennet on his side, one man could not possibly stand against him. "Yes, William, I will write to father." It was with regret that she glanced out the window to note that shadows were deepening where there had last been bright sunlight. It was time for her to return to her sister. After all, that was why she was at Netherfield Park. Her voice was quiet as she stared at her hands twisted into fists on her lap. I need to see to Jane, William." It was the death knell. The end of this beautiful period had approached. Desperation filled Darcy as he stood and paced in front of the dying fire. He turned and looked at her as she sat on the settee. He suddenly became aware of the pendulum's movement as it ticked the seconds passing. She was bewitching. That same curl that had escaped the confines of her hairpins continued to rest against her neck. He still longed to run his hands through that curtain of hair that he was somehow certain hung past her waist. Her small foot still tapped the floor in a rhythm all her own. It drew him in, and he thought his heartbeat was now moving in a syncopated rhythm, like the metronome his sister used when she practiced the pianoforte. Her hands were small. He had lovingly held those hands, and only moments ago they had caressed the sides of his face as he had pulled her closer to him. Her small frame had fit perfectly with his larger, manly one. He knew that if she was standing in front of him, he could easily rest his cheek on the top of that pile of curls. How soothing that would be to him, like balm to his soul. He walked until he stood directly in front of her. She rose from the settee. Looking up at him, she could see his intense stare, that she had earlier incorrectly interpreted as finding fault. Now she could see strong emotions swirling in his magnificent dark eyes. They drew her even closer, until her breath caught.
"Before you go, Elizabeth, you must allow me to tell you how ardently I admire and love you."
If it was the last thing she would hear when she left this room, he wanted it to be this. He was completely certain of his feelings, and knew that they would not change. If, by chance, she did not return his love, he would never marry another. Darcy would never allow another woman to take her place in his heart or in his home.
"I do love you, my dearest, loveliest Elizabeth. I vow before you and God in heaven that my love for you will only grow stronger with each day that passes, with each breath I take. I vow to care for you, and for any family that we might have. I vow to protect you and yours. I vow that my love will never stray. Truly, Elizabeth, There is no greater woman on this earth who is more perfect for me than you. I will—"
His emotions were so intense that he had to stop and take a breath.
"I will love you forever, Elizabeth. Only you. Forever."
Elizabeth could not stop the tears from trailing down her cheeks. Never had she imagined that she would receive the kind of love that this man offered. In her childish dreams, her knight in shining armour would offer his love and protection with a rescue, a quick "I love you" and a flower. Reality was so much better. Darcy had been tested by life's uncertainties, so his words had weight. This was not some immature boy who was unqualified to take the lead in the family. He was a man, a gentleman, and he was her gentleman. It took a moment for her to regain her composure. She was not aware that he saw what he thought was awe on her face. He observed no visible signs of turmoil or distaste, and the relief he felt almost dropped him to his knees. William, I am at a loss to tell you how much your words mean to me. They are precious, and I will cherish them all of my days." Elizabeth smiled through her tears. "I wish that you had the power to read what is in my heart. You are dear to me, dearer than I could have imagined a man could be." She reached her hand up and gently caressed his cheek. She felt him lean into her hand. His eyes glistened with moisture, yet none fell to his cheeks. I vow to love you, and to live with you as your wife for all of our days." She gave a slight giggle. "I would vow to obey you in everything that you say. However, I do believe that I will struggle with this for my whole life." He chuckled as well, already knowing that her independent, intelligent mind would seek to understand before she would act. Other men might balk at being with such a strong woman, but Darcy welcomed the challenge.
"Elizabeth, you have just promised to love me all of our life. Do you mean it?"
He knew that his honour demanded that he ask.
"Are you certain that it is not the emotion of the moment that is swaying you to speak such words?"
"Oh, William, I do love you so." She leaned up on her toes and brushed a kiss across his lips. Before he could pull her in tighter, she rocked back on her heels. "This is not the work of a moment, for the truth is that you have always attracted my attention, for good or bad. I have not been able to remove you from my mind since the night we were introduced in Meryton. As you have watched me in public, I realise now that I have watched you as well. My heart is full, you dear man. I will marry no other than you." The kiss was passionate, and the embrace that followed was one of comfort and release. This time they were uninterrupted by the footman, and both were eternally grateful.
"Come, Elizabeth, we must tend to our duties. You will write to your father, and I will listen to Bingley as he makes arrangements for his sister."
He started laughing deeply. "William, whatever are you about?"
"If only Caroline Bingley knew the results of her interference today. It was not until I heard you defending me to Bingley for my actions against her that I truly hoped for this outcome. So she has my gratitude, if nothing else."
"Certainly, William, she will have nothing else, for you are mine, and I am yours."
"I love you, my Elizabeth."
"And I love you, my Will." He dropped to one knee.
"Miss Elizabeth Bennet, holder of my heart, will you do me the honour of accepting my hand in marriage?"
He held his breath until she answered. They had made their vows, and he believed her declaration of love. However, this one question begged an answer, and would determine his fate. Elizabeth bent down and kissed him again. He had taken her hands in his, and she squeezed them gently. "It would be my honour to be your wife. Yes, Mr. Darcy, I will marry you." He jumped up, grabbed her around the waist, and spun her joyously around and around. Then there was silence as he lowered her feet to the floor and kissed her until it took her breath away.
"Forever, Elizabeth."
"Forever, Will." They walked hand in hand to the library door. With one last kiss and a quick embrace, they parted and left the room. The footman had heard and seen it all. He had observed Miss Elizabeth's composure when under attack from Miss Bingley in the days prior to the visit to the library, and he had also observed the kind guidance that Mr. Darcy gave Mr. Bingley. They would make a fine couple and have a happy future. With their exit from the room, the footman looked inside to make sure the embers in the fireplace were burned low. He backed out of the room and closed the library door, a small smile on his face. Chapter 9. Celebration. 6 months later, Pemberley Library. William, do you recall where we were 6 months ago on this day? Elizabeth was nestled next to him on the settee, gazing at her husband's profile. The book on her lap lay completely ignored. Darcy was distracted by the latest book of poems he had received by post just that morning. He wanted to find the perfect prose to memorize and recite to Elizabeth later in their chambers. Darcy knew how she delighted hearing the lovely words whispered in her ear.
Yes, dear.
Elizabeth chuckled at his distraction. They had been married 4 months, and she delighted to watch the days pass at Pemberley. Her love for him had been entrusted to a man who treasured that emotion. He performed each task that came before him as if his own life were at stake. Thus the tenants, neighbouring landowners, and members of Darcy's own household benefited. Elizabeth loved her new sister Georgiana. She hoped to share a secret with her in the morning. First, she needed the attention of her husband, so he would be the first to find out. "Will," she whispered. That got his immediate attention.
"Yes, love."
He closed the book, keeping his long index finger inside to mark his place.
"I apologize for being distracted. How may I be of service?"
He loved his Elizabeth to distraction. Each day he was happier than the last that she was his wife. "Do you recall where we were 6 months ago today?" she repeated.
"I do. I gave my most excellent proposal to you in Bingley's library, and you were pleased to accept."
He grasped her hand in his and kissed the back of it, a smile in his eyes. "Well, dear William, I would like to share with you a glimpse into the future."
"Really?"
Darcy was sceptical. He wondered just what his wife was up to. "Yes, for in about 6 more months, I believe we will have a little Darcy join us in the library, distracting us with his or her amazing Darcy presence." It took but a moment before the meaning behind her words became clear. Darcy carefully took her into his arms and embraced her tightly. He would be a father.
Could my joy be more complete?
Nothing could dim the smile of the husband and wife, and nothing could dim the smile of the footman standing outside the door, the same smile he had worn 6 months earlier while standing outside the library at Netherfield Park. Epilogue. Childhood. 6 years later. Pemberley. Mrs. Miller, the heir's nursemaid, had misplaced the young master yet again. He was not in the nursery with his younger brother Michael. He was not in any of the family rooms. He had not joined his mother and baby sister Emma in his mother's study. Nor was he to be found, as he often was, with his father. Master Alexander James Darcy, the 5-year-old son of Mr. and Mrs. Fitzwilliam Darcy, looked like a miniature version of his father. However, the twinkle in his eye and his thirst for adventure was inherited directly from his mother. It was a mixture that caused constant consternation to his nurse. Standing at the top of the stairs, hands on her wide hips, hair slightly loose around her rosy cheeks, she blew a strand of greying hair away from where it was tickling her right cheek. There was only one course of action. She needed to join forces with John, the lower hall footman, who faithfully guarded the doorway to the library and the master's study. Of all of the Pemberley staff, John seemed to best understand the machinations of young Master Alex. Mrs. Miller took in a deep breath and released it quickly as she descended the stairway. It was a relief to see that Alex was not perched on the banister, ready to slide down to the bottom, to see how far he could launch himself across the foyer's marble floor. As she made a turn at the end of the hallway, she observed John at his post. He was a tall, slim man with sandy blonde hair and soft, kind blue eyes. It was a matter of pride that he showed no expression other than calm on his handsome face. Nevertheless, he shared a love for young Alex that was fierce. If anyone on the lower floor knew where Master Alex was, it was the footman. It had only been a few minutes prior to the nursemaid's appearance that the young master had arrived. He had held a wooden sword in his right hand, and a short red string in his left. A blanket had been tied carelessly around his small shoulders, and a hat was perched on top of his dark curls. "Mr. John," Alex had whispered, shifting his eyes back and forth, as if he was wary of anything or anyone that might interrupt. As soon as the footman bowed to him, his countenance stern, the boy continued. "Might I have your assistance, please?" "Master Alex, I am at your service." "Oh, Mr. John, I'm not Master Alex." He stepped back so the footman could get a clear view of his apparel, and then lowered his voice to attempt to have the deep resonance of his father. "I am the dread pirate Darcy, the scourge of the seven seas." The footman endeavoured not to smile, though his left brow did lift, slightly. "I see, Pirate Darcy. Where be ye headed today, Captain Alexander? Do ye have a fair wind for your sails? Be ye after treasure?" "Not today, first mate John Footman." He gave a swoop of his sword, and then pointed it to the ceiling. "We are after the Intrepid, the fastest sloop in the British Navy. On board is my pirate friend Bluebeard." Alex lowered his voice and stepped closer, cupping the hand holding the sword around the right side of his mouth. John had leaned down to hear the young boy, but rapidly stepped back to avoid the dull point of the blade. "What be your heading, Captain Darcy?" "Point her toward the sun, first mate John, and heave to. We shall run them down and show those blue jackets what real fighting men are about." Alex stepped back and gave his sword another swish. "I'm off to my quarters to plot our course." With that he ran into the library. The footman enjoyed his life at Pemberley. There was peace in the family, and noise in the halls with the two sons. The second son, Michael, was a smaller version of young Alex, but had the quiet intensity of the master. The baby was but a few months old. Time had passed, and the events of life came and went. His services had been varied. It had been he who had found the housekeeper, Mrs. Reynolds, when Mrs. Darcy's pains had started with all three of her children. Each time had found Mrs. Darcy in the library, her favourite room in the house. It had been he who had kept silent company as the master paced back and forth in that same room, waiting for news that his wife and child were well. It had been he who had picked up the young master and dusted off his behind as he tried to run before he could walk the lower halls. And it had been he who had become the faithful companion to Alex when he was the dread pirate Darcy, a knight of the Round Table, a general in the army like his uncle Richard Fitzwilliam, or the future master of Pemberley. John looked up to see Mrs. Miller and knew what she was after. It was a pattern that repeated itself almost daily. With a slight nod of his head, he tilted it toward the open library door. As she walked by him, she quietly inquired, "And who might Master Alex be today?" "Pirate," he whispered, almost without moving his mouth. So still and erect did he stand. It was not until she had entered the room, and the hallway was empty, that the first hint of a smile could be found. Reflection was good for the soul, he thought. When he heard the dread pirate Darcy squeal, he could no longer contain his smile. Peeking around the doorway into the room, he saw Mrs. Miller backed against the wall, feigning fright and terror. Captain Darcy was holding her at sword point, ready to tie her with his red rope. He had caught his prey. Bluebeard would be free to roam the seven seas with pirate Darcy, and life at Pemberley was safe for another day. The end. This has been The Library by J. Dawn King, narrated by Stevie Zimmerman. Copyright 2014 by J. Dawn King. Production copyright by J. Dawn King.